Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God, back with you with the next video in my series reading The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Without further ado, returning to The Call of the Wild as read by Lord Naren White. When he felt him grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his splendid strength. But the progress shoreward was slow, the progress downstream amazingly rapid. From below came the fatal roaring, where the wild current went wilder and was rent in shreds and spray by the rocks, which thrust through like the teeth of an enormous comb. The suck of the water as it took the beginning of the last steep pitch was frightful, and Thornton knew that the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over a rock, bruised across a second, and struck a third with crushing force. He clutched its slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of churning water shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own, and swept on downstream, struggling desperately, but unable to win back. When he heard Thornton's command repeated, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high, as though for a last look, then turned obediently toward the bank. He swam powerfully, and was dragged ashore by Pete and Hans at the very point where swimming ceased to be possible and destruction began. They knew that a time a man could cling to a slippery rock in the face of that driving current was a matter of minutes, and they ran as fast as they could back up the bank to a point above where Thornton was hanging on. They attached the line with which they had been snubbing the boat to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it should neither strangle him nor impede his swimming, and launched him into the stream. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough into the stream. He discovered the mistake too late, when Thornton was abreast of him, and a bare half-dozen strokes away while he was being carried helplessly past. Hans promptly snubbed with the rope as though Buck were a boat. The rope thus tightening on him in the sweep of the current, he was jerked under the surface, and under the surface he remained till his body struck against the bank and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered to his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to them, as though they could not make out the words of it. They knew that he was in his extremity. His master's voice acted on Buck like an electric shock. He sprang to his feet and ran up the bank ahead of the men to the point of his previous departure. Again the rope was attached and he was launched, and again he struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He had miscalculated once, but he would not be guilty of it a second time. Hans paid out the rope, permitting no slack, while Pete kept it clear of coils. Buck held on till he was on a line straight above Thornton. Then he turned, and with the speed of an express train, headed down upon him. Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck struck him like a battering ram with the whole force of the current behind him, he reached up and closed with both arms around the shaggy neck. Hans snubbed the rope around the tree, and Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water, strangling, suffocating, sometimes one uppermost and sometimes the other, dragging over the jagged bottom, smashing against rocks and snags. They veered into the bank. Thornton came to, belly downward, and being violently propelled back and forth across a drift log by Hans and Pete. His first glance was for Buck, over whose limp and lifeless body Black was setting up a howl, while Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes. Thornton himself was bruised and battered, and he went carefully over Buck's body when he had been brought around, finding 3 broken ribs. "That settles it," he announced. "We'll camp right here." And camp they did, till Buck's ribs knitted and he was able to travel. That winter, at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit, not so heroic, perhaps, but one that put his name many notches higher on the totem pole of Alaskan fame. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the 3 men, for they stood in need of the outfit which it furnished, and were enabled to make a long-desired trip into the Virgin East where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the El Dorado saloon, in which men waxed boastful of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was the target for these men, and Thornton was driven stoutly to defend him. At the end of an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. "Pooh, pooh," said John Thornton. "Buck can start 1,000 pounds." "And break it out, and walk off with it for 100 yards?" demanded Mathewson. A bonanza king, he of the 700 vaunt. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, John Thornton said coolly. Well, Mathewson said, slowly and deliberately, so that all could hear, I've got $1,000 that says he can't, and there it is. So saying, he slammed a sack of gold dust of the size of a bologna sausage down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. The enormousness of it appalled him. He had great faith in Buck's strength and had often thought him capable of starting such a load. But never, as now, had he faced the possibility of the eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor had Hans or Pete. I've got a sledge standing outside now, with 25 pounds, sacks of flour on it, Mathewson went on with brutal directness. So don't let that hinder you. Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face in the absent way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is seeking somewhere to find the thing that will start it going again. The face of Jim Brine, a Mastodon king and old-time comrade, caught his eyes. It was as a cue to him, seeming to rouse him to do what he would never have dreamed of doing. Can you lend me 1,000? He asked, almost in a whisper. Sure, answered O'Brien, thumping down a plethoric sack by the side of Mathewson's. Though it's little faith I'm having, John. That's the beast can do the trick. The beast can do the trick. The El Dorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. The tables were deserted, and the dealers and gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager and to lay odds. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, banked around the sled within easy distance. Mathewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple hours, and in the intense cold it was 60 below zero. The runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Men offered odds of 2 to 1 that Buck could not budge the sled. A quibble arose concerning the phrase break out. O'Brien contended it was Thornton's privilege to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from a dead standstill. Mathewson insisted that the phrase included the breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the snow. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bed decided in his favor, whereat the odds went up to 3 to 1 against Buck. There were no takers. Not a man believed him capable of the feat. Thornton had been hurried himself into the wager, heavy with doubt, and now that he had looked at the sled itself, the concrete fact, with the regular team of 10 dogs curled up in the snow before it, the more impossible the task appeared. Mathewson waxed jubilant. 3 to 1, he proclaimed. I'll lay you another 1,000 at that figure, Thornton. What do you say? Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soars above odds, fails to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to all save the clamor for battle. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their sacks were slim, and with his own the 3 partners could rake together only $200. In the ebb of their fortunes, their sum was their total capital, yet they laid it unhesitatingly against Mathewson's 600. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was put into the sled. He had caught the contagion of the excitement, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. Murmurs of admiration at his splendid appearance went up. He was in perfect condition without an ounce of superfluous flesh, and the 150 pounds that he weighed were so many pounds of grit and virility. His furry coat shone with the sheen of silk. Down the neck, across the shoulders, his mane, in repose as it was, half bristled and seemed to lift with every movement, as though excessive vigor made each particular hair alive and active. The great breast and heavy forelegs were no more than in proportion with the rest of the body, with the muscles showed in tight rolls under the skin. Men felt these muscles and proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down to 2 to 1. We'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care, and thanks again.